So the topic for today's conversation is models of interfaith leadership in an age of polarization. And for the past few weeks, I have been carrying this topic around in the form of a question. What is the role of an interfaith leader in a polarized age? As a Christian seminary educator with very deep interfaith commitments, I've actually been carrying this question around for a very long time, and analogous questions as well. But I'm going to spare you a decade or so of rumination and try to distill this in its simplest form. What occurred to me this week as I posed this question to myself is that I would argue that the role of an interfaith leader in a polarized age is to confront every form of polarization. And I'm using this particular phrase, I'm invoking Pope Francis's historic address to Congress in 2015. He was talking about violence done in the name of religion, and he said, quote, "We know that no religion is immune from forms of individual delusion or ideological extremism," end quote. He noted the delicate balance required to combat violence while also safeguarding freedom, and added, quote, "There is another temptation which we must especially guard against, the simplistic reductionism which sees only good or evil, or if you will, the righteous and the sinners. The contemporary world with its open wounds, which affect so many of our brothers and sisters, demands that we confront every form of polarization which would divide it into these two camps," end quote. What I particularly appreciate about this quote is how Francis names categories, good, evil, righteous, and sinner, that can be found in most Sunday school curriculums, and I dare say most seminary classrooms. So I hear in this a particular call to me as a Christian seminary professor to confront the complicity of my own tradition in calcifying these categories. Now, I'd add that the problem is not that these binaries exist. They are categories of consciousness that are part of learning to name what we come to know. But the problem is in the simplistic reductionism that sees only these categories and not the spectrums between or within. Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, in his book, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence, points to what he calls pathological dualism as the root cause of a lot of religious violence. When we fix people into these hierarchically ranked binaries and irrevocably split them into good and evil camps, they inevitably start looking a lot less like us, and a process of dehumanizing rhetoric can begin to take hold. And we know from history that dehumanizing language has dire consequences. Scholar and professor of historical theology Beverly Mitchell writes about systematic dehumanization, which is at the root of both white supremacy and anti-Semitism, in a very powerful book called Plantations and Death Camps, Religion, Ideology, and Human Dignity. Mitchell defines what she calls the sin of dehumanization as defacement, which I think is a really powerful way to think about it, and writes, quote, "The absence of empathetic imagination, the inability to see members of the pariah group as being like oneself, is the psychological foundation for participating in dehumanizing a fellow human being." Now, a new wave of brain science is adding to our understanding of the neurological dimensions of this phenomenon. David Eagleman, who's a neurologist, reports on work that looks for changes in the medial prefrontal cortex, a region of the brain that becomes active when we're interacting or thinking about other people, but is not active when we're dealing with inanimate objects, like a pen, for example. Now, when researchers showed pictures of people from different social strata to volunteers while measuring brain activity, the researchers found that this area of the brain was less active when volunteers looked at a homeless person, as opposed to a professional athlete or a doctor or lawyer, and commented, quote, "It's as though the person was more like an object," in terms of the scans of the brain. Now, when Eagleman considered this study and his own experiments related to the neurology of empathy, He saw a chilling link to the history of genocide. Genocide is only possible, he says, when dehumanization happens on a massive scale. So this is why I see it as a primary role of an interfaith leader to confront every form of polarization and to interrupt and call out distortions that come about through this dehumanizing rhetoric. Finally, the last point I want to make is, and that I think is really important in this context where Ibu brought up this point about politics and thinking about the polarization in our political discourse. This is not an exclusive tool of the political left or right. For example, in 2016, Representative Hank Johnson, a Democrat, compared Jewish people to termites. Michael Flynn, a retired US Army Lieutenant General and may surprise some of you, a registered Democrat who had a short-lived appointment as the National Security Advisor in the current Republican administration, has described Islam as a cancer. It's easy to slip from disagreeing with a policy or a practice to demonizing a people. And this is the line that we must notice and refuse to cross, and call out when it is crossed. Given this, I think it's incumbent that we do this work, that we approach interfaith leadership in ways that does not create new lines of polarization and new openings for dehumanizing rhetoric. The next obvious question, of course, is how do we do this? You see, I didn't leave very much time to answer that next question. Because I think it's a question, in part, that we need to each answer for ourselves, depending on the goals and contexts of what we're doing, and that each of us on this panel might answer slightly differently. For me as an educator, one answer is that I tend to privilege relational models of teaching and learning, like small group discussions, site visits, storytelling, the Pluralism Project's case studies, and other what I would call humanizing pedagogies. This is also why I've put a lot of energy into field building work. Interreligious or interfaith studies, I would argue, is fundamentally relational on multiple levels. With its emphasis on dismantling stereotypes, building authentic relationships across lines of difference, highlighting moments of interreligious cooperation, and building an appreciative understanding of diverse traditions, it offers tools and strategies for rejecting polarizing rhetoric or simplistic reductionism and contributing to an inclusive national ethos that is sorely needed at this moment. Thanks.